A shocking moment unfolded in the courtroom. A black boy stood up in the middle of the trial and said something no one expected. His words stunned everyone, causing the renowned judge to lose her usual composure. No one could have foreseen the truth about to be revealed, a truth that could change everything. What made that boy dare to stand up in the middle of the trial and declare something unimaginable? Before we delve into this emotional story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another surprising story, just for you. The story begins. In a courtroom divided by racial prejudice, a black boy stood up and declared to the judge, "You're my mom." What happened next will leave you speechless. The courtroom was packed that morning. Rows of people sat in tense silence, their eyes darting between the judge's bench and the defendant's table. It was a case that had attracted local news attention. A black boy named Ethan, no more than 12 years old, was brought before the juvenile court on charges of trespassing in a wealthy neighborhood. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized wooden chair. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans that seemed too big for him. His sneakers were worn and tattered. His hands gripped the edge of the table, trembling slightly. Across the room, the judge, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and an air of authority, prepared to begin the trial. Judge Eleanor Hart was known for her no-nonsense demeanor. She had a reputation for being particularly tough on cases involving juvenile offenders, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. As she flipped through the case file, her cold, detached expression revealed no emotion. The court clerk called the courtroom to order. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Hart," he announced, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged courtroom. Everyone stood, their movements stiff, the weight of the trial heavy in the air. Eleanor glanced down at Ethan, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Be seated," she said, her voice crisp and professional. As the rustling of footsteps subsided, she addressed the court. "This case involves charges of trespassing and unlawful assembly. The defendant is accused of entering private property without permission. How do you plead?" Ethan looked up, his brown eyes wide and watery, as if he was fighting back tears. His lawyer, an overworked and underprepared public defender, leaned down and whispered something in his ear. Ethan hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. "Not guilty," he finally said, his voice barely audible. The judge nodded curtly, scribbling something in her notebook. "Proceed with opening statements," she said, gesturing to the prosecution. As the prosecutor began to outline the case, Ethan's eyes wandered, nervously scanning the room. His gaze returned to Eleanor, and his breath hitched. He stared at her face, his expression shifting from fear to something deeper, recognition. The prosecutor droned on, recounting the details of the alleged trespass, how Ethan was found in a gated community after dark, how a homeowner had called the police, and how Ethan had been uncooperative during questioning. The words seemed to fade into the background as Ethan's focus remained fixed on the judge. Eleanor noticed his stare, her eyebrows furrowing slightly. "Defendant, do you have something to say?" she asked, her voice laced with impatience. Ethan hesitated, his small hands gripping the edge of the table tighter. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were now on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped, his lips trembling. Eleanor sighed. "If you have nothing to say, we'll continue." "I know you." Ethan blurted out, his voice shaking but loud enough to echo through the room. The words hung in the air, met with confused murmurs from the gallery. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Ethan's chest heaved as he tried to steady his breath. I know you," he repeated, his voice cracking. "You're my mom." Gasps rippled through the room. Someone in the back muttered audibly, "What did he just say?" Eleanor froze, her pen hovering over her notepad. For the first time in her career, she looked utterly taken aback. Her eyes were locked on Ethan, studying his face as if trying to piece together a puzzle she never knew existed. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice low but trembling. "You're my mom," Ethan said again, tears streaming down his cheeks. His voice was hoarse, filled with a pain that seemed far too large for his young age. The courtroom was utterly silent, as if the world had stopped turning for a moment. Even the prosecutor, who had been shuffling papers, sat motionless. Eleanor's hand trembled as she placed her pen down. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice wavering, but her face betrayed her. Something in her eyes had shifted, confusion, denial, and something deeper, fear. Ethan's small voice cut through the silence. "You gave me away when I was little. My foster mom told me everything." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder. She glanced at the court clerk, then at the public defender, who looked as stunned as everyone else. I need a moment," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We'll take a short recess." As she retreated to her chambers, her legs felt unsteady. She couldn't shake the image of Ethan's tear-streaked face, his words echoing in her mind, "You're my mom." In her chambers, Eleanor pressed her hands against the edge of her desk, her breath shallow and rapid. Memories she had long buried began to surface, painful and chaotic fragments of her past that she had tried to forget. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Ethan sat back in his chair, tears still streaming down his face. The room buzzed with whispered speculation. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, sensing a story far bigger than they had anticipated. The boy had just revealed a secret that no one saw coming. But for Eleanor Hart, it was a secret that threatened to shatter the life she had carefully constructed. Eleanor stood in her chambers, the echo of Ethan's words reverberating in her mind like a haunting melody, "You're my mom." She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white as she tried to compose herself. The air was thick, each breath a struggle. For years, she had locked that part of her life away, hidden behind her degrees, her judge's robe, and the walls of the courtroom. Yet now, it was unraveling before her in a way she never could have imagined. Eleanor hadn't thought about that time in decades. She was just 18, a scared girl from a small, conservative town when she found out she was pregnant. The memories flooded back, the arguments with her parents, the shame in their eyes, and the agonizing decision to give her child up for adoption. It was the only way to move forward, or so they had convinced her. She took a sharp breath, pushing the memories back where they belonged. She was Judge Eleanor Hart now, a respected authority figure, with a reputation to uphold. She couldn't let this boy's words derail her life. But no matter how hard she tried to compose herself, the image of Ethan's tear-streaked face haunted her. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Judge Hart, her clerk's voice was cautious, almost hesitant. "The courtroom is waiting." Eleanor straightened her posture, forcing herself into the calm, authoritative demeanor she wore like armor. She adjusted her robe, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The moment she stepped out, the murmuring from the courtroom ceased. All eyes were on her as she returned to her seat on the bench. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched tightly together, his eyes red but defiant. His public defender whispered something in his ear, but Ethan's focus remained fixed on Eleanor. Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice firm. "Court is back in session. Proceed." The prosecutor rose, looking hesitant. "Your Honor, given these extraordinary circumstances, I believe it would be appropriate to verify the defendant's claims." "Is there any basis for this?" "Enough," Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp. She couldn't let this turn into a spectacle. "We are here to address the charges, not unsubstantiated claims." But Ethan wasn't finished. He stood abruptly, his small frame trembling with emotion. "It's not a claim," he said, his voice cracking. "It's the truth." "Sit down, young man," Eleanor commanded, her voice wavering slightly. "No!" Ethan shouted, the pain in his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You can't ignore me. You can't pretend I don't exist." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Eleanor couldn't hide her shock. Her heart pounded as she stared at the boy, his words crashing over her like a tidal wave. She wanted to scream back, deny everything, but the certainty in his eyes was undeniable. "You stopped this response." Eleanor hadn't thought about that time in decades. She was just 18, a scared girl from a small, conservative town when she found out she was pregnant. The memories flooded back, the arguments with her parents, the shame in their eyes, and the agonizing decision to give her child up for adoption. It was the only way to move forward, or so they had convinced her. She took a sharp breath, pushing the memories back where they belonged. She was Judge Eleanor Hart now, a respected authority figure, with a reputation to uphold. She couldn't let this boy's words derail her life. But no matter how hard she tried to compose herself, the image of Ethan's tear-streaked face haunted her. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Judge Hart, her clerk's voice was cautious, almost hesitant. "The courtroom is waiting." Eleanor straightened her posture, forcing herself into the calm, authoritative demeanor she wore like armor. She adjusted her robe, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The moment she stepped out, the murmuring from the courtroom ceased. All eyes were on her as she returned to her seat on the bench. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched tightly together, his eyes red but defiant. His public defender whispered something in his ear, but Ethan's focus remained fixed on Eleanor. Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice firm. "Court is back in session. Proceed." The prosecutor rose, looking hesitant. "Your Honor, given these extraordinary circumstances, I believe it would be appropriate to verify the defendant's claims." "Is there any basis for this?" "Enough," Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp. She couldn't let this turn into a spectacle. "We are here to address the charges, not unsubstantiated claims." But Ethan wasn't finished. He stood abruptly, his small frame trembling with emotion. "It's not a claim," he said, his voice cracking. "It's the truth." "Sit down, young man," Eleanor commanded, her voice wavering slightly. "No!" Ethan shouted, the pain in his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You can't ignore me. You can't pretend I don't exist." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Eleanor couldn't hide her shock. Her heart pounded as she stared at the boy, his words crashing over her like a tidal wave. She wanted to scream back, deny everything, but the certainty in his eyes was undeniable. "I remember your face," Ethan continued, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My foster mom showed me pictures of you. She said you were scared, that you wanted me to have a better life. But why didn't you come back for me? Why didn't you even try?" The room was deathly silent, everyone's eyes glued to him. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't since she was that terrified 18-year-old girl. Finally, she forced herself to speak. This is neither the time nor the place to discuss this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan's lawyer stood up, his face pale. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client deserves answers. If there's any truth to his claims, it changes everything about how we proceed." Eleanor felt the walls closing in again. She looked around the room, at the sea of faces filled with expectation, and realized there was no escape. Her carefully constructed life was crumbling before her eyes. But before she could react, the courtroom doors swung open. A woman in her late 40s, with a weary face and kind eyes, stepped in. Her presence immediately commanded attention, her hesitant movements betraying her unease. Ethan turned to look, and his face lit up with a mix of relief and anguish. "Miss Clara," he called out, his voice cracking. Eleanor stared at the woman, her heart sinking. Clara Adams, the name hit her like a jolt. She hadn't heard it in years, but she would never forget it. Clara was the social worker who had facilitated Ethan's adoption, the one who had assured Eleanor she was doing the right thing all those years ago. "Your Honor," Clara said softly, her voice trembling. "I apologize for the interruption, but I think it's time we all had the truth." Eleanor's throat tightened, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe this was happening, not here, not now. Ethan turned back to Eleanor, his eyes pleading. "Please," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Just tell me why. That's all I want to know." Eleanor's composure shattered. She looked at Ethan, at Clara, then back at the courtroom filled with curious, judgmental eyes. She realized she couldn't run from the truth anymore. Her voice was barely audible as she said, "Recess. We'll take a recess." She banged the gavel and stood, fleeing into her chambers before anyone could stop her. Behind her, the courtroom erupted in a flurry of whispers, questions, and speculation, but none of it mattered to Ethan. He sank into his seat, his heart heavy. For him, it was no longer about the charges or the courtroom. It was about the woman he had dreamed of his whole life, the woman who had just turned her back on him once again. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the door to Judge Eleanor Hart's chambers slammed shut behind her. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the polished wood in front of him. The weight of rejection pressed down on him. The courtroom was a whirlwind of hushed speculation. Clara Adams stepped forward, her presence commanding attention even amidst the chaos. She walked to Ethan's side, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Ethan," she whispered. "You've been very brave." Ethan shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "I just wanted her to say something," he said, his voice barely audible. "Why won't she even talk to me?" Clara had no answer. She had been a social worker for decades, guiding children through the maze of the foster care system, but Ethan's case had always weighed heavily on her heart. She had seen him bounce from family to family, waiting for someone to claim him permanently, and now he was facing the one person who could give him the answers he sought, only to be met with silence. Meanwhile, Eleanor paced within the confines of her chambers, her heart pounding in her chest and her palms clammy as she grappled with the gravity of the situation. This was no longer about maintaining order in the courtroom or preserving her reputation. This was about a boy she had given up long ago. She sat at her desk, her hand trembling as she opened a drawer. From inside, she pulled out an old photograph, its edges frayed from years of being hidden away. The photo showed a newborn baby swaddled in a yellow blanket, its tiny face scrunched up in sleep. She traced the outline of the photo with her finger, tears stinging her eyes. Eleanor had spent years convincing herself that she had done the right thing. She was just a teenager then, scared and overwhelmed. Her parents had insisted that giving the baby away was the best option for everyone. "It would ruin your future," they had said. "He'll have a better life with another family." But as the years passed, the memory of that baby never left her. She had wondered about him constantly. Did he grow up happy? Was he loved? Did he ever think about the mother who had abandoned him? And now, Ethan was here, standing in her courtroom, shattering the walls she had built around herself. Eleanor's breath hitched as a gentle knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Judge Hart," it was Clara's voice, soft but firm. "May I come in?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing at the photo in her hand before quickly tucking it back into the drawer. She straightened her robe and cleared her throat. "Come in." The door opened, and Clara stepped in, closing it softly behind her. She looked at Eleanor with calm, understanding eyes. "You don't have to say anything," Clara began, but you should know that the boy out there is hurting. He's been through more than any child should have to endure." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm aware of the situation," she said curtly. "No, you're not," Clara countered, her voice gentle but firm. "Ethan has been in the foster care system his entire life. He's been let down by every adult he's ever trusted, and now he's standing in front of the one person he's dreamed of finding, only to feel like he's being abandoned again." Eleanor flinched at Clara's words, but she didn't reply. Clara took a step closer. "I was there, you know," she said, her voice softening. "The day you signed the papers, you cried so hard I thought you would change your mind, but your parents wouldn't let you, would they?" Eleanor's composure crumbled, a tear sliding down her cheek. She turned away, unable to meet Clara's eyes. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's not over," Clara emphasized gently. "You have a chance now to give Ethan what he's been searching for his whole life, a sense of belonging, a connection, the truth." Eleanor sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know how to face him," she confessed. "What can I possibly say to make up for everything he's been through?" Clara placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "It's not about saying the perfect things. It's about being honest. Ethan doesn't need excuses or apologies. He just needs to know you care." For a moment, the room was silent. Eleanor took a shaky breath and nodded. "I need a moment," she said. Clara offered a gentle smile and left the chambers, leaving Eleanor to grapple with her thoughts. In the courtroom, Ethan sat silently, his head bowed. Clara approached him, crouching down to meet his eyes. "It won't be perfect, Ethan," she said softly. "She's scared, just like you, but I think she's starting to understand how much you need her." Ethan's lip trembled, but he nodded, wiping away tears. "I just want her to tell me why," he repeated, his voice cracking. Finally, Eleanor emerged from her chambers, her face unreadable, but her steps were firm. She walked to the judge's bench, her eyes briefly meeting Ethan's before she spoke. "This court is here to address legal matters," she began, her voice even, "but I recognize that there is now something far more important at stake." She paused, her voice faltering slightly. "Ethan, I owe you the truth. If you'll allow it, I'd like to speak with you privately." The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Eleanor silenced them with a single gesture. "This is not a spectacle," she said firmly. "This is a personal matter, and I demand everyone's respect." Ethan stared at her, his wide eyes filled with hope and apprehension. Slowly, he nodded as the court clerk escorted them to a private meeting room. Eleanor felt the weight of decades pressing down on her. This was her chance to face the past and the boy who had waited a lifetime for her to show up. The meeting room was small, its white walls amplifying the tension between Eleanor and Ethan. A lone table sat in the center of the room, with two chairs facing each other. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving only the muffled hum of the courthouse in the distance. Eleanor stood frozen by the door, her hand gripping the knob as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Ethan sat across from her, his small hands nervously fidgeting in his lap. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. The defiance he had displayed in the courtroom was replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "Could you sit down, Mom?" Ethan said softly, his voice cracking. It was strange, an invitation from a boy to the woman who was supposed to have all the power. Eleanor nodded stiffly and walked to the chair, slowly lowering herself as if the weight of the moment could shatter her. She clasped her hands in front of her, her fingers twisting together in an attempt to steady herself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the pain of lost years. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Why did you give me away?" he asked, his voice trembling. His eyes were filled with tears, but he held her gaze, determined to get the answer he had spent a lifetime wondering about. Eleanor's breath hitched. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him for the first time. His deep brown eyes, filled with hurt, reminded her of the baby she had held in her arms all those years ago, the baby she had told herself she was doing the right thing by. "I want to know why you gave me away," Ethan said, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with tears but still fixed on hers. "Why didn't you keep me?" Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She stared at Ethan, realizing that the boy in front of her was no different from the infant in the photo. "You know, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "I was very young when I had you. I was only 18, and I was very scared. My parents said I would ruin my life if I kept you. They said you would have a better life with another family. But why didn't you come back for me?" Ethan asked, tears streaming down his face. "Why didn't you ever try?" Eleanor looked down at the floor, feeling a wave of shame wash over her. "I did try," she said, her voice a whisper. "I tried to find you, but I couldn't. My parents said it was better if I left you alone. They said you had a good family and I shouldn't disrupt your life." Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "But you're my mom," he said. "You shouldn't have given up on me." Eleanor looked up at Ethan, feeling her heart break. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was wrong to give you away, and I was wrong not to come back for you. I was wrong to let my parents tell me what to do. I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry." Ethan looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with tears. "Do you love me?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her own cheeks. "I love you, Ethan," she said. "I've always loved you. I never stopped thinking about you." Ethan lunged forward, throwing his arms around Eleanor, hugging her tightly. Eleanor embraced him back, tears streaming down her face. She felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had spent years trying to forget the past, but she could never forget Ethan. Now, she was finally reunited with her son. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." "I love you, Mom," Ethan said, tears streaming down his face. Eleanor smiled, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too," she said. Is this enough?" Ethan stared at her hand for a long moment, his own hand trembling as if unsure what to do. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and placed his hand over hers. "I don't know if it's enough," he said softly. "It's a start," Eleanor replied, her voice filled with hope. For the first time, a flicker of understanding passed between them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, a fragile connection between a mother and the son she had lost but never forgotten. The courtroom was nearly empty when Ethan and Eleanor emerged from the meeting room. The court clerk had cleared the gallery, leaving only Clara and Ethan's public defender waiting by the judge's bench. Clara looked up first, her face filled with quiet hope as she saw Ethan walking beside Eleanor. For the first time that day, Ethan's face wasn't etched with anger or pain. Instead, he looked hesitant, as if unsure of what the future held. Eleanor, on the other hand, looked visibly drained, her eyes red and her shoulders slumped under the emotional weight of the conversation they had just shared. But in her heart, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of clarity. Clara approached them, her eyes darting between the two. "How did it go?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. "We talked," he said. "She told me the truth." Clara nodded, her warm smile encouraging. "That's a good start." Eleanor cleared her throat, addressing Clara in a voice that was still finding its strength. "I want to do better by him," she said. "I don't know how yet, but I won't walk away this time." Clara studied Eleanor for a moment, her eyes filled with understanding. "It will take time," she said, "but if you're willing to be there for him, you'll figure it out." Eleanor nodded, the determination in her eyes hardening. She turned to Ethan, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," she said softly, "but I'm here. Whatever you need, I'll be here." Ethan's lip trembled as he looked at her. For so many years, he had dreamed of this moment, meeting his birth mother, demanding answers, and perhaps even finding some kind of closure. But the reality was far messier than he had imagined. Still, something in Eleanor's voice told him she meant it. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. Eleanor reached out, placing a hesitant hand on his shoulder. "That's okay," she said. "We'll take it one step at a time." Ethan glanced at Clara, who gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, he took a deep breath and said, "I want to try. I want to know who you really are." Eleanor's heart swelled at his words, and she felt a tear slide down her cheek. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said softly. The following weeks were a delicate dance of healing and learning. Eleanor took the first step by arranging regular visits with Ethan. She insisted they meet in places where he felt comfortable: parks, libraries, and even the youth center he frequented. Their conversation started slowly, often awkward and hesitant, but with each meeting, Ethan opened up more, sharing pieces of his life that Eleanor had missed. He told her about the foster families he had lived with, the friends he had made and lost, and the dreams he had for his future. Eleanor reciprocated, sharing pieces of her own story, telling him about her struggles as a young girl, her journey to becoming a judge, and the regrets that had weighed on her heart for so many years. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench, Ethan asked her, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you had kept me?" Eleanor took a long breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Every day," she admitted. "But I can't change what I did back then. All I can do is try to make things right now." Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes I'm still angry," he said. "That's okay," Eleanor replied. "You're allowed to be angry. I just hope that one day you'll let me earn your forgiveness." Ethan turned to her, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. "Maybe," he said softly. Their relationship didn't transform overnight, but it began to grow in small, meaningful ways. Eleanor surprised Ethan one day by showing up at his youth center to watch him play basketball. Ethan, initially taken aback, looked confused, but when she cheered for him after a perfect shot, he couldn't help but smile. Eleanor also worked with Clara to understand how she could support Ethan in the long term. She researched therapy options, explored programs that could help him build confidence, and even started attending community events to better understand the world he had grown up in. It wasn't always easy. There were tense moments when old wounds reopened and moments of doubt when Eleanor wondered if she could ever truly make up for the lost years. But every time she felt herself faltering, she remembered the look in Ethan's eyes when he had placed his hand over hers in the meeting room. Months later, the courtroom where they had first met looked very different. Ethan stood beside Eleanor during a small ceremony, surrounded by a few friends, Clara, and a handful of court staff. The judge presiding over the event smiled warmly. "Today we celebrate a new chapter," she said. "Eleanor Hart has officially requested legal guardianship of Ethan Williams, and both parties have agreed to proceed." The room erupted in applause, but for Ethan and Eleanor, the noise faded into the background. Eleanor turned to Ethan, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan looked up at her, a small but genuine smile spreading across his face. "I think we'll be okay," he said softly. Eleanor nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I think so too." As they left the courtroom together, hand in hand, the past no longer felt like an anchor holding them back. Instead, it became a foundation they could build upon together. For the first time in many years, they both felt the weight of hope outweigh the fear, guiding them forward into a future filled with possibilities. This story isn't just about a courtroom, it's a journey of finding connection, forgiveness, and love. Have you ever faced a difficult decision and then had to deal with the consequences later? If you were Eleanor, what would you have done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice can be an inspiration to many. If you found this story meaningful, please share it with your friends and family to spread the message of forgiveness and family love. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more heartwarming stories. Let's create a world filled with love and understanding together. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading humane values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.